Hey everybody, today I want to explore the implications of the niche concept a little more and look at a concept we looked at earlier, which was duplication of species at each trophic level. And then I also want to introduce the detritivore and decomposer, or what we just call the decomposer part of the food web. Earlier, I explained the duplication of species at each trophic level as a result of the evolution of niches, and now I want to look at this in a little more detail. For example, in an eastern forest, there may be 200 species of plants, 600 species of herbivores, 80 species of secondary consumers, 10 species of tertiary consumers, and 2 species of quaternary consumers. Now, I got to admit, I looked for data that would give me those numbers, and I just made those numbers up, but they seem about right to me. As you can see, 200 species of plants, that's a lot of duplication at that primary producer level. 600 species of herbivores, that's a lot of duplication at that primary producer level. And so we want to ask a little bit more. We want to go into a little more detail about why biodiversity is as great as it is at these levels. And you have to understand that each of these species has population density that fluctuates from year to year. Some of these may be at their carrying capacity and therefore subject to the pressures of density-dependent mortality factors, and some are not, so they're not subjected to the same thing. Each of these species has its own niche. Some have niches in which they compete with others, and some have niches that have allowed them to escape competition. The first thing I want to do is think about low population density and what its effect is on species in a community. One reason for the duplication of species is because many species that occur at such low densities, so far below their carrying capacity, that things such as competition, disease, and predation don't make that big a difference in their population dynamics. It is the density-independent effects that are much more important. When you live in this kind of low-density population, it allows specialization, niche specialization, because the lack of competition means that you can have many species in very similar niches, and from there they can evolve to become specialists. So you have many species in the same niche, and over time they can specialize. And it will also allow niche generalization because generalists will only lose out when they're outcompeted by a specialist. But if their populations are so low that competition itself is not that big a deal, then generalists will not be affected, and generalization of the niche can also evolve. And in other words, taxa such as insects that are often limited by density-independent factors often become very diverse precisely because of this reason, because all their populations are below carrying capacity, and therefore they don't suffer the effects of competition and disease and predation as much, and they're able to maintain themselves in replicate niches and then evolve into new niches over time. One of the terms I introduced there were specialists and generalists, so I want to talk a little bit about them. Specialization occurs when an organism's niche becomes limited. For example, an insect that evolves to eat only one or a few species of plants would be becoming a specialist. Or an insect that limits the part of the ecosystem that it uses. For example, in a rainforest, the canopy only, or the understory only. That would be specialization. Or an organism could limit the time when it's active, as the eastern frogs seem to be. They have different times during which each population is active for mating. So that would be all specialization. The benefit of specializations are decrease in competition, a more reliable food source, and many other things that allow an increase in reproductive output compared to being less specialized. Generalization occurs when species broaden their niche. For example, when an insect is able to eat a larger number of plant species or maintains the ability to eat a large number of species, or when it breeds during the entire warm season. That would be generalization. And generalization may increase the effect of competition because a generalist may have different things it competes with, but it usually means that it also will always be able to find its food source. So generalists have stability that way. This allows us to think about some of the trophic categories we talked about earlier. And I just wanted to point out how we can do that. For example, predators are generally much larger than their prey, as we discussed earlier, the reasons for that. And they kill by brute force. They kill by the fact that they're much bigger. This strategy works for many kinds of prey. So as a result, there's a small number of niches available, and predators tend to be generalists. They tend to eat a lot of different things. They aren't specialist predators. On the other hand, there is some room still for specialization. For example, if we look at raptorial birds, such as hawks, some eat mammals, other species specialize on birds, some specialize on small rodents and insects, and some eat fish. So there is some degree of specialization, but even within those categories, they're pretty generalized. Bird hunting raptors will eat all sorts of birds, not just one or two species. Mammal hunting birds will eat all sorts of mammals, not just one or two species. Parasites, in contrast, are usually specialists. Well, let's think about this. Remember, a parasite is an organism that appropriate a small amount of the productivity or the energy of their host without killing them. In other words, they just want to get a little bit to eat without the host noticing. Since they live on or in their hosts, they are often very small and unobtrusive, and their population density has to remain low so they can escape detection by the host and so that they aren't deadly, which would be two bad things for parasites to have happen to them. And by specializing, they can maximize their ability to get energy from the host. So we see that parasites are often specialists. And by using this definition, we can see that many herbivorous, that is plant-eating insects, are parasites. They live on or in the host plant. They are small compared to the plant, and they never do enough damage to actually kill the plant. One of the most interesting things about talking about all this is it turns out parasitism is a very common strategy. And you might not have thought that if I had asked you, what is the most common thing to be? And you probably would have said, an herbivore or a predator. But let's take a look at the numbers. Within insects, about 35% of all species are thought to be plant parasites, as opposed to plant herbivores. I'll let you think about what the difference might be. And about 35% are thought to be animal parasites. So that means that about 70% of all insects, and insects are by far the most numerous animals on the planet, are parasites. Since about 80% of the world's animals are insects, that means that at a minimum 56% of all animal species are parasites. That's over half. So that means that most energy transfer in a trophic pyramid is through parasitism and not predation. In contrast to this, only about 4% of insects are predators, and 22% are detritivores and decomposers. Sure, most birds are predators, but there are only 8,000 to 10,000 species of birds. So we're talking, 4% of all insects is something on the order of 40,000 species. And there's only 8,000 to 10,000 species of birds. So that's another 8,000 predators right there. So you can see the insects really overwhelm what the most common strategy is. The number of species in an ecosystem is one component of biodiversity. And biodiversity is a concept that we will study more about later. But I wanted to give you that idea that number of species is one of the components in biodiversity, because that's a term you've probably heard about. Now, the second idea I want to talk about is that energy in an ecosystem does not go to waste if it is available energy. Instead, it is used until it has all been turned into waste heat. But if there is still organic matter with usable energy in it, something's going to use that. Let's take a look at that, and we'll see what the consequences of that is. Our picture of ecology so far has failed to account for all the waste produced by organisms. And as animals, we tend to think of waste as urine and feces. But in addition, we must also account for the dead skin and dead hair that falls off us, and ultimately our dead bodies. They all need to be recycled. Plants and certain animals lose parts of their body all the time: branches, bark, leaves, flowers, pollen, etc. And so this all contains usable energy. And where does all this go? Well, even though it's waste to us and it appears to be useless from our perspective, it still contains usable energy. And so it is used by various organisms. Organisms that utilize the energy in waste are known as detritivores and decomposers. And we're going to see that they recycle matter as well. So we're going to see how that happens. Detritus is waste or debris. So if you eat waste or debris, you're a detritivore. And the types of organisms we call detritivores are those that usually have a digestive system, like everything you see in these photos, and they therefore make additional waste themselves. But in the process, they break waste products down into smaller and smaller bits. Examples include these raccoons, flies, dung beetles, earthworms, all sorts of insects and invertebrates are detritivores. And if you get a chance, you should take a look at this David Attenborough film from YouTube, and it really shows some interesting aquatic detritivores. In contrast, we have decomposers, and decomposers finish the breakdown of organic material. They convert the remaining carbon-based compound back into carbon dioxide and water. And they, in general, don't leave any waste product, or they don't leave anything behind except for their bodies. They are microbes, and they include fungi, molds, bacteria, archaebacteria, those kinds of organisms. And here are some pictures of them: a beautiful poisonous mushroom, a turkey tail mushroom, the mold on your tomato, this fungus that's living off rotting wood, the mold on your citrus fruits in the refrigerator, more forest mushrooms, more dead tree mushrooms, this purple thing, which is just so cool looking, that fungus on your toe, and that mold that makes a delicious cheese. These are all decomposer organisms. If we want to put D&Ds, that's not Dungeons and Dragons, but detritivores and decomposers into the trophic pyramid, you can see we've done that here. And you can see that at every level there is energy-rich carbon-based compounds that go to the decomposers. The other thing you can see about this here, which is interesting, are these arrows, which I'm going to explain in a second. So at every trophic level, some of the energy is lost as waste, and it's shown by those yellowish arrows to the decomposers. And in this diagram, decomposers include the detritivores. They eventually break down the waste into carbon dioxide, water, and heat, so it gets completely broken down. But note that the dark arrows in this diagram also show the flow of mineral nutrient movement. As you can see, decomposers put mineral nutrients back into the soil, and then those things are picked up by the producers. I want to talk a little bit about nutrients in this idea because it's a new idea. In addition to energy, as organisms lead their lives, they also need to take in matter, that is, atoms. And the 6 most important elements can be remembered using the mnemonic device SPONCH, S-P-O-N-C-H, which stands for sulfur, phosphorus, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and hydrogen. And yes, it's true. If you go to Mexico, there is a cookie called Sponge, and I've had them. They're not very good, and I don't recommend you put them in your mouth. Hope I don't get sued for that. How do these mineral nutrients get into the food chain? Well, photoautotrophs, which is what we all depend on, get their C, H, and O from photosynthesis, that is, from carbon dioxide and water that are combined to make sugars in photosynthesis, but they get the other 3 from their roots. And nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur all occur as ions in the soil, and they're dissolved in the soil solution. So let me explain that for a second. Ions, you'll remember, are charged monoatomic or polyatomic compounds, and the soil solution is a thin coat of water that you can find around the soil particles or inside organic matter in the soil. So in that soil solution, as we call it, there are low concentrations of these ions that contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, and these are sucked up by the roots of plants. Other important elements that plants also need to get from the soil, and that then the heterotrophs need as well, are sodium and potassium, or natrium and kalium if you're from Europe, calcium, copper, manganese, and magnesium, plus another 18 or so minerals. So that's it for today. What we're going to do next time is we're going to look at how the matter cycles occur. And specifically, we're going to look at the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the sulfur cycle. And these are all really interesting, and they're all affected by human beings, and they all cause environmental problems when they're affected by human beings. And we're going to look at that as well in the next few weeks. So I hope today that you learned more about how to think like an ecologist and how to understand why there is species diversity at every trophic level. And then I hope you understand how now we've incorporated the decomposers and the detritivores into our trophic pyramids so that we can see that all energy that is fixed by photosynthesis eventually gets used up as heat. There's none of it really stored anywhere in a useful form, except for soil organic matter and other places where the organic matter doesn't decompose. And I hope you also understand that these decomposers also recycle mineral nutrients that are necessary for all of life to obtain, starting with the photoautotrophs who suck them up in their roots, and then they're passed on to heterotrophs that eat the plants, or heterotroph that eat the eaters of the plants, etc., on up the food chain. Until next time, study hard.